Now.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm Amy Goodman. 3 out of every 4 lobbyists who represent oil and gas companies previously worked in the federal government. That's according to a new analysis by the Washington Post. That's a rate that's more than double revolving door standards in Capitol Hill. The oil and gas industry has more than 600 registered lobbyists in Washington, and key hires include 18 former members of Congress, dozens of former presidential appointees. The lobby's influence has been on full display in the wake of the BP oil disaster. Proposals to enact new restrictions or curb oil use have stalled because of Republican opposition and strong objections from Democrats in oil-producing states. In this segment, we're going to take a look at oil and coal, specifically mountaintop removal. But first, oil. Steve Kretzmann is with us, founder and director of Oil Change International. He's at the Netroots Nation conference. Welcome, Steve. What about this revolving door? What about the power of these lobbyists?
I mean, the oil and gas industry and the coal industry are some of the most powerful lobbies in Washington. What we see is things that don't make sense. For instance, on June 15th, as 100,000 barrels a day were spilling into the Gulf of Mexico, there was a vote on removing subsidies, handouts to the oil and gas industry. It failed miserably in the Senate. 20 Democrats, including climate champions like Senator John Kerry, voted against removing subsidies to the oil and gas industry. Why does this kind of thing continue to happen? Why is it so hard to get good energy legislation through Washington? The influence machine for the oil and gas industry is one of the big reasons, unfortunately.
This is a moment, a window of opportunity where the country united, Republican, Democrat, Independents, Greens, see the tragedy of our dependence on oil with the BP oil spill. What do you think needs to be done now?
Well, I think in particular we need to demand that Congress breaks its addiction to dirty energy money. If you go to dirtyenergymoney.com, you can look up how much money your representatives are taking from the oil and gas industry and from the coal industry as well.
That's dirtyenergymoney.com?
That's right. And you will be able to then write your representatives and demand that they stop taking campaign contributions from the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of other ways that influence works as well. Lobbying money in particular is, that we've seen lobbying expenditures from the oil and gas industry in particular soar in the last quarter. The American Petroleum Institute nearly doubled their lobbying over the last 3 months for obvious reasons. But this is one way that we can begin to make sure that our representatives represent us and not the dirty energy of the past.
When we were traveling through southern Louisiana, through the bayous and the towns, so devastated by this oil spill, one of my colleagues bumped into a Nigerian executive for Chevron who was there in the Gulf. And he was looking around and said, this happens, sort of proportionately in the Niger Delta communities every day. They live with us. Now, Steve, you have a long history of working in the Niger Delta.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, it's been going on for 50 years in Nigeria, right? And so this kind of ongoing spill, this kind of ongoing discharge, the fouling of the waters, the fouling of the lands there, and the destruction of the way of life for the communities. In the Niger Delta, most of those communities were traditionally dependent upon fishing. They can't be anymore. And so you have people driven to desperation who are really trying to eke out a living because of the destruction wrought by the industry there. There's a lot of problems, obviously, in Nigeria, but the oil and gas industry and the discovery of oil by Shell and others in the Delta has really been a problem for those communities, as it is all around the world, unfortunately. It's not something that you don't drill your way to prosperity or development, and that's an ironclad rule across the board, wherever you are in the world, and it applies, unfortunately, to the Gulf of Mexico as well as it does to the Niger Delta.
Yeah, it's interesting when we see angry businessmen in these southern Louisiana towns. We don't call them militants. We call them angry, aggrieved businessmen.
Right.
What about what we see in the Niger Delta?
Well, obviously the Niger Delta, people have been driven to the point where, where they are taking up arms. And that's, we don't endorse violence in any way, shape, or form, but you look at the demands behind what a lot of the militants are asking for, and it's the same demands, for instance, that Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni were calling for 15, 20 years ago, which is a cleanup of their area. It's, a better share of the revenues to be able to put it back into community development. But at the end of the day, the most forward-thinking activists in the Delta, and indeed in oil-producing areas all over the place, recognize that the only answer is transition and actually breaking their addiction to the oil economy and building a new clean energy economy.
We want to go from oil to coal.